Good afternoon. I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today for Disciple Time as we are focusing on God's love and our weakness. And we are going to look at the Last Supper today where we see Judas betraying Christ. But one of the things I wanted to share leading up to that was a story about how we got the boat Ada 4. That was the name of the boat, Ada 4. It was one of the coolest boats that my grandfather had ever built. And I recall as a kid going to my grandfather's house there in Virginia, and he used to live on the James River in one of those little outlets that led out to the Chesapeake Bay. And one of the things I loved to do when I went over there was to go out with him on the boats that he made and help him pick up the crabs out of his crab pots. So he had these crab pots strewn all through the river leading out to the bay, and he would use this really long pole that had a hook on it to reach down and grab these little ropes that he had with crab pots strung all over him, and he would pull those ropes up and he would empty the crab pots. And so we ate a lot of blue crab, probably so many that if I never see another blue crab as long as I live, that'll suit me just fine. But one of the cool things is he used to build his own boats out of wood. And I wish I could go back in time and see how I did it because it was really amazing. But on this particular occasion, when I was going to my grandfather's house for dinner, I noticed when I arrived that the boat Ada 3 was gone and it was low tide. So the boat being gone at low tide generally wouldn't happen. And I can still smell that muddy low tide smell because literally on his inlet, when it was low tide, it was all the way down to the mud. And it was something that you just couldn't mistake for anything else, the smell. Yet my granddad, he was not with the boat. In fact, he was there at the dinner table waiting for us. And I recall that he had this very upset and also sad look on his face. It was a combination of anger and sadness. And then he told us what had happened. So one of his neighbors who had damaged his own boat had come over during the day and taken the boat that my grandfather had built. Now, what made this particularly hurtful for my granddad was this was actually one of my granddad's friends from the shipyard, and none of us could really comprehend why he would do something like that. He didn't ask if he could use the boat. He had helped my grandfather with the boat from time to time, but he gave no reason at all. He just took it. And the problem was my grandfather had actually seen him taking the boat and pushing it up into his garage. And so when he confronted him about it, the neighbor just denied it. He wouldn't let him on his property. And so we arrived for this meal, and my granddad is sitting there at the meal with this expression on his face. He knew who had taken the boat. He knew who had betrayed him in this instant, and he was just trying to figure out how he was going to respond. He had already kind of confronted him, and now he was thinking, should I involve the police? What's going to have to happen here? And this was the memory that popped into my head as I read the readings for today. And so we see in the gospel reading today that they're at the supper, and Jesus has just basically told them that someone is going to betray him. And so Peter, wanting to know who it was, kind of coaxes John, the disciple that Jesus loved, into asking him. And we have this little exchange here in John 13. He leaned back against Jesus, this is John's, leaned back against Jesus' chest and said to him, "Master, who is it?" And Jesus said, "It is the one to whom I hand the morsel after I dipped it." So he dipped the morsel and took it and handed it to Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot. After he took the morsel, Satan entered him. So Jesus said to him, "What you are going to do, do quickly." And of course, we know as the story unfolds that Judas would eventually betray Jesus even with a kiss to identify him to the authorities. Now, as I thought about this, I was like, man, can you imagine walking with Jesus for all that time, witnessing all the miracles, sitting at the feet and hearing those teachings and those parables, and then in a blink of an eye, just handing him over like a lamb to be slaughtered? But here's the interesting thing. We find that when the hammer of Rome and the Sanhedrin came down on Christ, It wasn't just Judas who betrayed Christ in this moment. In fact, what we see is that none of the disciples stood by Christ through the trials. They all fled. Even worse, look at what we read further down in the gospel. We read this: Peter said to him, "Master, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Amen, amen. I say to you, the cock will not crow before you deny me 3 times. Now, Peter, the one who had been so bold and courageous up to this point, he would go on, yes, to deny Christ not once, not twice, but 3 times until the cock crowed. Then he realized that. And really, that is our story. We're no different than these disciples that were following Jesus. The weakness we have, which accompanies our humanity, is something that we all deal with. But fortunately for us, God's love is not like our human love. It's, in fact, even in our weakest moments, God can still love us and forgive us and be kind to us like a father. And here's the interesting thing, right? That, we know with Jesus' resurrection that he forgave his disciples. In fact, he came and comforted each of them, even Peter, and he spent extra time with Peter because he knew how bad Peter felt in his moment of weakness. But we can really relate to this, I think, because I know there are times when we as people, we don't always choose the harder right. There's times, for whatever reason, that we're weak, we're fearful, we lack wisdom, we choose wrong for whatever reason. I think that's what happened with my grandfather's neighbor. It turns out that he was actually drunk and he was having medical problems, he was having financial issues, and all this kind of came out as my granddad decided to talk with him more. And in a moment of desperation, he thought he was just going to take my granddad's boat, I guess, and sell it on the side. Well, it just so happened that my granddad had already decided he was going to build a bigger boat to get his crabs and all that anyway. And so he actually let the neighbor keep Ada 3, and he helped the neighbor with some side jobs. And this is actually how we got Ada 4. And that's what I wanted to share with you. This is how we got Ada 4. See, my granddad had a love for his neighbor, and my granddad wasn't even that much of a religious person, but he was loving towards him in that moment. And I think this teaches us something, just as Jesus' example teaches us something, right? It teaches us this, and this is our application for today. In our humanity and weakness, we may fail. We may fail God, but God's love for us never fails. And I love this quote out of 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 to 10, where we read this: "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. I will rather boast most gladly of my weaknesses, in order that the power of Christ may dwell with me. Therefore I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution, and constraints for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And I think so many times we beat ourselves up when we fail. And, the fact is, we're human. We're not going to have 100% track record of virtue. It's just not going to happen. And so we need to understand that there's room at the cross for everybody. And it's not dependent on our track record. It's not dependent on us, having some perfect, sinless life. No, if that was the case, then what would be the point of Christ?